Welcome back all. Thank you for joining us. Today it's the sequel I have been looking forward to recording for a while now. I'm joined by the charming and witty Chris Naunton, Egyptologist extraordinaire, to discuss his newest release, Egyptologists' Notebooks, and the so-called Golden Age of Egyptology. But was it all that golden in reality? Stay tuned to find out. Before I get there though, I do have a quick announcement if you'll indulge me. Like many people producing these shows, it's beginning to dominate my life, and I'm hitting the point where I need the show to support itself. I didn't seek the support of the audience during the first couple of years of this show because, well, I wanted to see how viable this was and prove myself and the concept to all of you first. I would never ask for something for nothing, and I want to keep this podcast totally free at the highest level for all listeners. So I'd love nothing more than to grow this channel up from more than a hobby that I squeeze in between other gigs, and I have a lot of great guests lined up that I can't always fit in because I don't have the time between, scrabbling to keep food on the cat's table. Everything is the cat's, as most cat owners will attest. With enough support, this could become a regular show. But I cannot do it without you, dear listener. So if you feel like you can support the show and chuck in a buck, or $5, you do you, then I'd be much obliged, forever grateful. And I might even give you a shout out, or several. However, not one to do things the obvious or easy way, I am not setting up a Patreon. You heard that right, no Patreon. If you support the podcast, you get the podcast. Even if you don't support the podcast, you still get the podcast. But possibly not for terribly much longer. So if you want to do that, head on over to Liberapay, which is my current crowdfund/patron platform of choice, and any support will be hugely appreciated. And that can be found at Doc Harrison, that's DOC Harrison, on the Liberapay platform, and I'll stick links, wherever I can. But enough about that, on with the show. Chris Naunton is former director of the Egypt Exploration Society. He's appeared on the BBC and Channel 5, hosting shows covering everything from Flinders Petrie, the founding father of scientific Egyptology, to Tutankhamun, and numerous other shows, including Egypt's Unexplained files. He's currently the director of the Robert Anderson Research Charitable Trust, a London-based charity that provides support to visiting academics, and he's the president of the International Association of Egyptologists. And on top of all that, he's written 2 fascinating books now. The first, Searching for the Lost Tombs of Egypt, we discussed last year, so be sure to go and check out that episode. The second we'll be digging right into today. And in the following episode, yes, this is a 2-parter. So, for those of you who've been hankering for a deep dive into the world of early exploration, adventure, and groundbreaking Egyptology, well, you're in for a treat. Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Paul. It's so nice to be back. It's always just nice to have a chat, but if it's for a podcast, great. Why not?
Yeah, I've been looking forward to catching up with you actually, and it's been, I think, a year and a half since we got to chat about Lost Tombs.
Yes, so yeah, I think so. Spring 2019, which of course was in a different era,
a different world,
a different era of history.
Yeah. Absolutely, pre-COVID times. Just the simple pleasures of going for a coffee afterwards.
I know.
Not likely today.
Not washing our hands like 20,000 times in between and everything else. Yeah.
Oh, I have the dry skin to show.
That.
Given that it's been a year and a half, actually, that brings to mind just how prolific you must have been in your output for this book, because it hasn't been that long since Lost Tombs, really, in the grand scheme of things. So what, for anyone, let's start off actually at the beginning. For anyone who's not yet familiar with the book, could you give us a bit of an outline of what it is and what you set out to do in Egyptologist Notebooks?
Sure. So Egyptologist Notebooks is intended to be a kind of overview of the history of travel, exploration, and archaeology in Egypt. And Egyptology, I guess, is a blanket sort of term for all of those things. So from the very earliest Europeans in relatively modern times to have visited Egypt to begin to try to gather information to tell the story of ancient Egypt. And the story is told through archives, essentially. So the drawings, paintings, sketches, notes, maps, plans made by those travelers initially, ultimately Egyptologists and archaeologists. So it's not a blow by blow narrative account, the focus is on the illustrations, if you like. It was meant to be a kind of visual celebration of the last 2 centuries and more of exploration and discovery and Egyptology, and a celebration of the importance of archives to our subjects. And I suppose, I wanted to tell the story of Egyptology, and I wanted to somehow sort of get at the idea of our knowledge of ancient Egypt as it is now being just, where we are currently in a journey of discovery and gradual accumulation of knowledge.
An important record and way of, I suppose, accounting of ourselves, so to speak, as Westerners in ancient Egypt. So.
I suppose something that's, I've always been interested in how we know what we know. And you all know that, when you're doing research, part of the sort of job of research, especially once you get to kind of doctoral level, as you all know, is questioning the statements of fact, for want of a better way of putting it, and just making sure it's especially important in historical disciplines and archaeology that you go back to primary material, so that when you read in a book, King Tutankhamun reigned, blah, and he died at blah, you understand how we know what we know. And the point of that is to just make sure that those sorts of things are solid. And often it ends up with you revising these things. And so, I suppose as somebody who has been through that process, you can't help but be interested in the history of the subject and how it came together and how all that information was gathered. And I guess also, I've often found in studying the history of our subject that a lot of what we think we know is quite sort of arcane, and Egyptology's got its own strange sort of rules that you have to learn. Nobody tells you that there's these rules, but rules about the way that the names that we give to people or places, which often don't make any sense to people in Egypt. And these are Egyptological conventions. They're conventions and rules that exist within our subjects, and they came into existence for particular reasons, but not necessarily very good ones. They just did. And so, I love unpicking all that sort of stuff. And this is, I suppose, an attempt to sort of wind us back to a point in history when those conventions maybe were coming into being, so that people can see, like, oh, so that's why we call them canopic jars, or, whatever it is.
That's a good example, actually. I was going to ask. And I mean, I think this actually spurs me onto a question I was going to save for a bit later, but it makes sense to ask it now. And that's that, looking through this book, and I've got the book in front of me, actually, and I will occasionally flick through. So if you hear the pages moving on the other end, please excuse that.
It's a good sign that it really exists, and you.
And it's already full of little note stickers and things like that as well, so that
bless you.
Bring myself to the right place in the recording. But looking through this, and it really is a gorgeous thing, looking at these original notes, you get a kind of a strong sense of the lens through which a lot of these earlier travelers are perceiving the world. When you were going through these notebooks, and I'm thinking particularly of the kind of what we think of as the antiquarian travelers, starting out with Kircher and Sandys and people like that, was there any obstacle within their cultural framework, and even in their language and in their handwriting and things like that, when you're physically dealing with their work, was it difficult to penetrate at any point?
Yes. So in short, yes. So in the case of, I should say that in the case of some of our key figures, and the book is broken down into, I think it's 32 sections, each of which focuses on a particular individual, and sometimes that individual is representative of a group. And actually, by that, what I mean is, in some cases, it would have, from my point of view, in some ways have been better to have had a group rather than an individual, but it was the way the book worked for it to be 32 individuals and their archives. And archives are personal. They're in the way that they're kept and organized today, they tend to be arranged. You go to see the Robert Hay archive or the John Gardner Wilkinson archive or whatever. And I suppose another thing about archives, and another reason for focusing on them, is that you do get much more of a sense of the individual person and the moment and the place. These things are. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. I hope you don't mind.
No, go for it.
One of the things I guess that's was sort of underpins the whole book is that archives, these what we call archives now, what are archives now, but which are essentially, notebooks or journals or sketches or whatever. Most of the time, I think it's probably fair to say, these things were not intended to be the end of the process.
Yeah.
They were a means to an end, at the end being a published report. I think that's true. That's true most of the time. And one of the sort of justifications for doing a book like this is that, we know the published reports and we have the published reports, and the published reports are accessible, and publication is obviously incredibly important. It's it has historically been the way of circulating information like this. But for that reason, archives often tend to get forgotten, because once the published report is out, that's the important thing.
Yeah.
The published report is not unique. There might be hundreds of copies. Egyptology has never been a very, widely published thing. It might be hundreds of copies, it might be thousands of copies. The archive remains unique. The original manuscript sketches and notes, they remain unique. And they encapsulate much better than the published reports the individual creator, the author, and also, like I say, the moment, the place. So it's not quite as though individual pages still have grains of sand from Giza on, but in some cases that is actually true. We didn't get to feature them in the book, but the best example of this I can think of is that the EES Nubian survey records from the 1960s still have squashed nimity flies on the pages of them, because they were so prevalent at the time. They were being sort of swatted onto the page. Wow. So there's that kind of immediacy. Sorry, so that's my little tangent. That's another justification for the archives.
Yeah.
But so the question was, are there difficulties in getting to grips with these things? There are lots of difficulties. In some cases, the originals actually weren't accessible to me, so I was using secondary sources. In some cases, I was looking at published accounts rather than the originals. Even then, sometimes there were difficulties. So I wasn't able to go to George Sand's original notes and drawings. I don't even know, actually, I admit, I don't even know if they exist. But the published report itself, which came out in around about 1615, is written in such arcane to us language.
Yeah.
The spellings are a bit weird. The letterpress is a bit unfamiliar in some cases.
The S's look like F's in some
cases. Precisely. Which once you've got these things in your mind, it's not too difficult to get around them. One sort of turn of phrase that threw me in the case of Sands was that he would use the word diverse for different, or when we would use different or various. Diverse for us has a subtly sort of different meaning, and that threw me a lot because he uses it all the time. And of course it looks like die-earth in the thing. Anyway, these are things that you can sort of quite easily get through, and at least there's a kind of letterpress. In other cases, when you're looking at handwritten things, of course, you're reliant on being able to see things. Sometimes these might be pencil notes, which are very, very faint, or the handwriting might be almost impenetrable. These are things which are never intended to be seen by anybody, really. They were intended, as I say, for ultimately publication in the form of letterpress or whatever. And then, I mean, this is maybe not the kind of thing you were thinking of, but some archives are just much more accessible than others. So I admit that there is probably a bias in the book towards archives which are in the British Library, because they're for me, living in London, they were very easily accessible. And we were determined not to be too biased towards, and the archives that are in the British Library by and large relate to British, in the case of the Egyptologists, British individuals, or individuals who had a strong affiliation with England, with Britain. Joseph Akekian, for example, was an Armenian, but sponsored by Joseph Horner, who was in London. Yep. So in the case where archives were less accessible or even non-existent or completely inaccessible, and that might mean somewhere that was difficult for me to get to, or behind locked doors, for want of a better way of putting it, or just very difficult to make anything of because the handwriting was so difficult. That shaped the book. So it's also worth saying as well that the book does try to cover a vast amount of ground. Maybe inadvisedly, sort of large amounts of ground. So there were just loads of people who had to be left out. And loads of images and sketches and things that had to be left out. I mean, if I put in everything I'd wanted to put in, the book would be 10 volumes. I'm not even exaggerating. 10 volumes, and every copy would cost £1,000 to buy, and that would never work. That's a publishing proposition. So yeah, I can't help but feel as though there were compromises involved, and that is in part because it isn't easy to just get what you want from these things.
Yep. I mean, that kind of covers my question about the criteria as well of what is included and what has to be excluded from the work itself. Yeah. So who didn't make the cut?
Oh gosh,
so to speak. Too long a list.
It is a very long list. I mean, people who I'm almost sort of embarrassed to say, we had to miss out. Auguste Mariette is not in it.
Yeah.
Mariette. So another thing I should feel as though I should maybe say is, although at the outset of the interview here, I said it was, the book is intended to be a kind of overview of the history of Egyptology, because of all these constraints, because of the fact that we had to focus on particular individuals. We had obviously, I mean, it goes without saying, if there was no archive or there were no drawings, they weren't going to go in. And that might, in some cases, have meant really pivotally important figures in the subject. So it's for this reason that from the beginning, I wanted to include linking chapters, which are very short pieces of writing, 1,000 or 2,000 words, which there are 5 of them, and so the 32 characters are broken into 5 sections, and there's a kind of introduction at the start of each one. And that allowed me to introduce characters that weren't otherwise represented. Yep. So Auguste Mariette, the founder of the Antiquity Service, discoverer of the Serapeum, excavator extraordinaire from the 1850s onwards, founder of the National Museum collection, blah, 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 is not in the book. And that's mainly, I suppose, because there just isn't an archive in the same way for Mariette as there were for others. We could have done it, but the competition was very tough.
Yeah.
And most of his notebooks are lost, probably lost when the Boulac Museum was flooded in the 18, I'm not sure when.
It was the very end of the...
Yeah, end of the 19th century. Yeah.
That's right.
So he didn't make it. I wanted to include, from the very beginning, we also were determined, this is me and colleagues at Thames and Hudson, determined that we shouldn't, as far as possible, we should avoid falling into the trap of telling the history of the subject via all the usual suspects that you've heard about before.
Yeah.
We wanted some new and different characters that people hadn't come across, and lots of as much new material for people as possible. Yeah. And we were conscious as well that because of the way the world was and still is to some extent, to a large extent, it was a story of white men, to be honest, great white academic men. So we wanted a story that involved more women and more Egyptians in particular.
Yeah.
And again, that was harder than I would have liked it to have been because of the accessibility of archives. So in the case of Egyptians, there are just very, very few archives to draw on. Or even if they exist, the world doesn't know about them really yet, and they're very difficult to access. I was very fortunate that the Abydos Temple Project has discovered the Abydos Temple archive about 8 years ago, and so I could draw on some material from that, so that at least there was a representative kind of section for me to say, this is what I would have liked to have included more of. At least there's not none. But I would have liked more women. So in my original list, I had Margaret Benson and Janet Gourlay. And I think it's Margaret Benson and Janet Gourlay, and not Janet Benson and Margaret Gourlay. Somebody will kill me if I've got that wrong. The 2 excavators of the Temple of Mut, publishers of a volume on their excavations, and the Temple of Mut in Asheru, which is the Mut enclosure at Karnak.
Right.
And they were the first women to be granted an excavation permit in Egypt. And they excavated this incredibly important site, did a very good job of it. They were, both pioneering characters, end of the 19th century, absolutely operating in a male-dominated world, and going ahead and conducting these groundbreakingly important excavations. But there wasn't the archive, not immediately accessible. I wanted to include Amis Calverley and Myrtle Broom, who were the 2 EES epigraphers working at the Seti Temple at Abydos. There was archive in that case, but we had already a lot of first half of the 20th century epigraphers, including Nina Macpherson, Nina Davis, who was married to Norman de Garris Davis, and arguably the finest watercolor artist in herself, not just the two of them, but herself, a better colorist than Norman. He said that himself. So yeah, there are lots of people that I would have loved to include.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, those three in particular, I regret for various reasons. And I feel like, there will be people out there who are saying, why didn't you include this person? Why didn't you include this person?
Well, that's always the risk of making any list, though, isn't it? I mean, we can't please everyone all the time, but
it is.
Lots of material for potential sequels.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of dig into some of the specifics, actually, if you're up for that, and talk about some of these figures, particularly in the first. I worked my way through all of it, even though I must confess I had to speed read certain entries simply because of the time available to me.
Acceptable.
But I did have a really very thorough dig into certain sections because they're fascinating to me. I remember pouring through Who's Who in Egyptology back when I started my. It wasn't even my master's. I think it was the conversion course I had to do to undertake the master's at UCL. So it would have been probably around the time we met, actually, in the early noughts. And finding that whole era really fascinating, and reading Brian Fagan's Rape of the Nile at the time as well. There's something about getting a chance to look at the original records, because there's not a lot of artwork or picture-focused work about the early days of Egyptology. I mean, this is kind of unique and special in that way, I feel. Having a chance to look at these early depictions in a size where you're not squinting at a tiny little kind of 1 by 1 inch picture in the corner of the, Encounters with Ancient Egypt volumes that I loved as well. But
yeah.
It's really interesting to look back at people like, I'm going to say this wrong, and please correct all of my pronunciations, because I do murder pronunciations on the show all the time. So,
sure you did.
Athanasius Kircher.
That'll do for me. I don't. Do you know? I think he was German. I don't even know. Athanasius Kircher.
Kircher.
Yeah. I don't even know, Paul.
Okay. Well, cool. Let's go with Kircher, because that's how I would read it in English.
That's fine. Yeah.
He's infamous, in fact, in Egyptology for his, if we put it charitably, lack of accuracy.
Yes. Yeah, that's charitable.
Yeah. And this symbolic interpretation.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I want to pull this thread out is because I still see a fair amount of this happening in fields outside of Egyptology.
Interesting.
Where people are looking back and going, hey, before these Egyptologists got in the mix, it tends to kind of tie in with these ideas that there's some kind of Egyptological conspiracy that to hide the truth, quote unquote, about the ancient aliens or the ancient this, that, or what have you. So Kircher kind of doesn't start this trend, actually, to be fair. He's really reliant on the classical sources, the Greek and Roman sources of the time. And I'm curious about this, and I had come across this once before, actually, in the Encounter series, but the Mensa Isiaca?
Yeah, the so-called, or sometimes known as the Bembein tablet or the Bembine tablet. Yeah, that in some ways is the most damning part of the story, almost, for Kircher. The reason he's in the book is because he's a super interesting character. He's one of the first to give serious time and effort to trying to understand an aspect of ancient Egyptian civilization, specifically how to read the language. Yeah. How to read the hieroglyphic script. And as you suggest, he published a lot on his attempts to translate various hieroglyphic inscriptions. I think, to be charitable to him, he did recognize that there was probably a connection between hieroglyphic and Coptic, a language which to some extent is still in use even today, which is the sort of successor language. Well, it is a form of ancient Egyptian written in the Coptic script, which is a sort of Egyptianized version of ancient Greek. Blah blah blah. So he was on the right lines in that sense, but he did commit to conclusions about what the hieroglyphic inscriptions that he had access to said, and he was completely and utterly wrong, because, as you say, his approach was to try to see the signs as encoding wisdom texts which were available to him in the Corpus Hermeticum. And I mean, another thing which I think he did, which was useful, is that he did copy inscriptions, not brilliantly well, but not terribly badly either.
Yeah.
And in so doing, he was in contact with people who had been to Egypt or who had Egyptian objects in collections, and he was making it known that there was a scholarly purpose to gathering together inscriptions and trying to study them. And as it turns out, he didn't really get very far in doing that, but he sort of sets a ball rolling in that, suddenly there is scholarly interest in gathering these sorts of things. And that's one of the things that underpins, Egyptology, would underpin the work of somebody like Champollion, who eventually is the man we credit with our ability to read the ancient scripts and language now.
Yeah.
It's just gathering together material.
Yeah.
But so among the things that Kircher was basing his work on was this Mensa Isiaca, or the Benbine tablet, which is now in the Museo Egizio in Turin, which didn't exist in his time, but the collections passed into the present-day Museo Egizio. Unfortunately for Kircher, he spent a long time studying individual signs on this supposedly Egyptian object, and trying to understand them. What he didn't realize, and there's no way he could have known this, is that this was an Egyptianizing object, but it wasn't authentically Egyptian. It was ancient. But it was made in Rome as something which looked like it was Egyptian, but by somebody completely uncomprehending of the language. So they made use of hieroglyphic signs, most of which are sort of recognizable, but they're it's a little bit, they don't make any sense. It's complete gobbledygook. So whereas there is a system underpinning, of course, there is a language underpinning the script. So for an ancient Egyptian scribe, if you needed to write on day 5 in the 3rd month of Shemu did Pharaoh Ramses II go forth unto battle with whoever, there was a right way of doing that. But whoever inscribed the Benbine tablet was just taking signs almost sort of at random out of a hat and just throwing them onto this thing. And Kircher didn't understand that, so he tried to read, sense into this thing that actually made no sense at all. Never did make any sense to anybody. So, like I say, I mean, he's interesting because he's sort of doing the right things, but he was completely and utterly misguided in how he set about what he was trying to do. I think it's a bit. Sorry.
I was just going to say, it reminded me a bit of the attempts of Horapollo, where everything was a symbol and not a letter.
Yes, exactly. Athanasius Kircher was not the last person to make this mistake. So for people like Thomas Young, Jean-François Champollion, who eventually get it right, one of the leaps of understanding is that hieroglyphic script is some signs are symbolic only; they don't have any phonetic value. Others of them do have phonetic value. So there is a way of writing words, even foreign words, in hieroglyphs, which is how it comes to be that if you go to a jeweler in Egypt now, they can write your name. They can write Paul or Chris in hieroglyphs, as the Egyptians would have done in the past. But the language also requires these other symbols. And Athanasius Kircher, Horapollo, and others put all of their eggs into that basket, seeing them as being entirely symbolic and not understanding that it was more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of stuff, should we say, to work through when interpreting this civilization without a language to go from. And I guess that's the important thing to remember, is that there's no framework for any of these early guys, Sands and Norden and Pocock. There's no framework for them to understand what they're seeing. I mean, the Sands kind of goes on this grand tour idea, isn't it? It's the well-to-do gentleman going on a grand tour. And he's making maps, really fascinating maps. I'm really glad you included those, actually, because they just look, well, I kind of want a poster of this. It just looks fantastic. And the language that's used and the typeface that's used, the fact that Mesopotamia appears on this map as Mesopotamia, and you think, wow, that's Arabia, the desert. It's quite romantic in a way, isn't it?
There is a certain magic to the idea. We can all indulge in the idea from the comfort of our 21st century suburban homes. The idea of there being uncharted territory. There isn't much of that in the world now.
Mm.
But, in the time of somebody like Sand 400 years ago, there really was, maybe not uncharted and unknown to everybody on the planet, but, from a European perspective, there was plenty of uncharted territory. And Egypt was at the edge of the known world for somebody like him. And so just to go there was an incredibly rare and unusual thing. And he didn't even get much further south than sort of Saqqara area before, instead of going further south, instead of making his way east towards the Levant across Sinai. But even that was absolutely pioneering. And more than 100 years later, when Norden and Pocock, independently of one another, but by total coincidence at almost exactly the same time, took a journey to Egypt, they didn't have much more knowledge to fall back on. And by going further south, as far as Aswan and a little way beyond, they were again really pioneering. And for me, that was part of the appeal of the whole subject and of wanting to do a book on it, is that idea of really genuinely not knowing what is over the horizon or around the corner, and going and seeing, anyway, despite all the risks and the dangers. And there's a great appeal in that adventure, both in terms of the physicalness of being there, but the intellectual adventure as well, of discovering something so strange and different.
And with characters like Norden, who you mentioned, and Pocock, I mean, one of the things that struck me when reading your account of their accounts and their accounts that you've included in the book, was just how stressful these journeys were. This wasn't a leisurely trip down the Nile on a felucca kind of thing. This was danger and sickness being very present in their everyday experience, the hostility of the locals as well. And it's something I hadn't thought about. So going back to Kircher for a second, and now that I'm hopefully pronouncing that correctly, the idea that the Inquisition was still a factor in examining things from ancient Egypt, that you may be considered to be indulging yourself in something too esoteric or too occult for the Catholic Church, for instance. I mean, is that possibly such a part of their reality that that's why there weren't more people involved in the study of Egypt back in the kind of 14th and 15th centuries and early 16th centuries?
I'm not sure I'm quite the best placed person to answer that question, actually. I in as much as I don't know that side of the history so well, but you're right that in the case of, I know Kircher's story well enough to know that the religious and political landscape in Europe was a massive influence.
Yeah,
he had to up sticks and leave the places where he was living and working on a number of occasions during his career, because as a Jesuit he was persecuted, and he ultimately settled in Rome because that's where he could live and work safely. But so from that point of view, yes, it was dangerous and difficult to visit Egypt, but then actually, just living was more dangerous and difficult and unhealthy in those days, in one way or another, than it is for us. So I'm sure that politics played a part, but there would have been also, as you suggest, cost. This was not something that anyone could do. You needed money, or you needed sponsorship. Norden for example, was commissioned by the King of Denmark to go to Egypt to make his exploration. Yeah. Pocock was traveling independently. So you needed money. You also need all the courage and equipment and daring do and a sense of adventure. But you also need, I think, a sort of leap of the imagination. It wouldn't have occurred to the vast majority of people to do this. Yeah. The thought wouldn't have entered their heads. So, if nothing else, those people, somebody traveling as early as Sand in particular, he wasn't the first or the only one. He's the earliest one in the book. Anyway, just to have had the thought, and then to have carried out that idea of traveling as an achievement in itself, to have survived and published an account, wow. Yeah. That's monumental.
Yeah, because Norden didn't survive, really, did he? I think his accounts were posthumous. Is that right?
That's right. He managed to get home okay, but and he didn't live for very long, and he died in his 30s, despite having had this illustrious career. I mean, in some ways, well, in many ways, his adventure to Egypt is what made his name.
Yeah.
But he was very high flying in the Danish Navy. So he was commissioned to go on this adventure, I think, in his 20s. Like, so he was about 26 when he went, but he'd already, he was more or less personally asked to do this by the King of Denmark because he'd been so impressive as a naval officer, cartographer. He was clearly just a very talented individual, an extraordinary, outstanding individual.
And his work kind of becomes a bit of a go-to, if not even a yardstick, for later travellers as well, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, he and Pocock's accounts are quite similar in many ways. I find it slightly difficult to separate the two of them, actually. Their drawings are quite distinct, but they were there, as I've said, they were there coincidentally at the same time. They actually passed each other on the Nile, although they didn't realise it in that exact moment.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that odd? At a time when there were so few Europeans around, that's how they realised. They realised there was another European, and subsequently, I think each inquired, who's that? Who the hell was that?
Funny.
But they both managed to publish their accounts, and that in itself is an achievement. In that, publishing was expensive, and commercial publishing didn't exist in the way that it would later. So you often needed to put together lists of subscribers in order to put together the money to do a print run. There wasn't nearly as big an audience of people able to purchase books, read books, etc., etc. So it, as you say, in Norden's case, his account was published posthumously, but that was still a number of years. He died a few years after his trip to Egypt, so it wasn't exactly Egypt that killed him, but he just succumbed to general 18th century ills, I guess.
Tuberculosis, I think you mentioned.
I think
right?
so. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, tuberculosis.
But it was thanks to the efforts of friends and supporters that the account was published. Thank goodness it was.
Yeah. It
does make you wonder. I mean, this is a sort of little throwaway aside. It does make you wonder how many other people might have been, but just didn't leave behind the records or never published. Yeah. I suspect that scholarship is such that there aren't too many of these things lying undiscovered now in trunks in the lofts of castles or whatever. But
of course. And so you mentioned Pocock, and we're kind of getting into the 18th century at this point with Norden and Pocock, aren't we? And the art. So one thing I did notice about the artwork in these early accounts is that, much like referring back to the kind of lens through which they're seeing this classical lens, a lot of the art seems to reference this neoclassical style. Instead of depicting what they're seeing per se, they're depicting what they're interpreting or what they think their audience back home perhaps would recognize.
I think you're basically it is the case that Egyptian art was very different. There is a very particular style to Egyptian art. It's not so far removed from reality. A human face in an Egyptian sculpture isn't so far removed from reality that's unrecognizable, but there is a particular style to it. And I guess draftsmen and artists would have been trained to render the human face and the human form in particular in a certain way that was very much informed by the artistic styles of the time and what was around. And so you as a result, Egyptian figures have these, as you say, sort of weirdly classical appearances rather than being more accurate, if that's not too loaded a term. It's difficult to know also to what extent things were adjusted along the way. So in the case of both Norden and Pocock, again, I was able to fall back on published accounts and on secondary literature on the archive and the process to gather together what I needed for the book. So some of what appears in Egyptologist notebooks are, I think, published engravings from the original drawings, and it's difficult to know whether the engravers themselves actually might have just slightly been tweaking or the appearance of things. But I think it also says something about our occupation with sort of like photo, or the idea of things being photorealistic, accurate. And we have photography, which of course is loaded and not necessarily accurate and unbiased.
Certainly not these days, no.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I think we have an expectation, and this is thanks to later Egyptologists, really, have an expectation that somebody drawing an Egyptian sculpture would draw it as it appears.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily so important, or what they were going for. So I think that's also a factor. The artists maybe weren't able to do it, but also actually maybe not so worried.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it kind of highlights the difference in concerns. For instance, actually, as I'm flicking through it, and you can hear the pages rustling. When I'm looking at Pocock's work, in particular, the one of the colossi, Memnon.
Yeah,
and it's almost cherubic.
Yeah, yeah.
Look at the face.
Yeah, sort of chubby cheeks, and it's a lot less rigid, isn't it, than Egyptian art really is.
Exactly, naturalistic kind of impression. And then you've got the hills on the next page. I must say, actually, and to all the listeners who haven't got their hands on a copy of this yet, it's really visually fascinating to see these journeys kind of unraveling in the explorer's own hand in many cases. And it lends a sense of intimacy to these accounts that I didn't experience when I was reading, Who's Who in Egyptology, for instance, or earlier explorations of these things, which I find is really unique.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely something we were going for. I mean, I should say that, I wrote the text for the book and I put the proposal together, and the sort of concept and the writing is me, but obviously the material speaks for itself to some extent. But I also owe a massive debt to colleagues at Thames and Hudson for being so determined to. I mean, they didn't commission a text, a narrative kind of a book like my Lost Tombs book was, with half a dozen illustrations here and there. They commissioned an illustrated book.
Yeah.
So they were absolutely right from the off that was what the subject needed. And they also, I only learned this actually very late on in the process, but they backed the designer, the person who laid the images out on the pages. And that's a very subtle and highly skilled art. It would have been possible to not do this book well or not do this book right, but the designer Aman Poole just did a fabulous job of making everything look right, and the images complement the text and vice versa in that way.
It's beautiful, actually. It's the job has been done well. It guides you through each section really well. I didn't get stuck anywhere,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel as though I can say this because, like I say, it's nothing to do with me really how it looks. But that a man there, some of the images are take up an entire page. In one case, one of the images occupies essentially 4 pages, in a fold out.
Oh, the Hekekian.
The Hekekian, yeah. To recognize that the images needed that, and to go ahead and do that is really great. But we were all absolutely in agreement from the beginning. It was just great to be able to work with a team that was so on board from the off on this. But we wanted to not crop images, for example. So where you've got, let's say, a drawing which is on a piece of paper, the edges of which are a little bit frayed, or maybe the edge of the paper is damaged because somebody put a paper clip on it 100 years ago and the paper clip rusted, and then somebody took it off and it left a massive mark. In the past, I think it's probably fair to say that would always have been cropped, so that you see the drawing but you don't necessarily see the edges of the paper, and we were all, without ever really having to discuss it very much, all absolutely on board with the idea that we should include the edges as well, so that you get the sense of the physical document. And that, I think, is really an important part of doing what you say and bringing to life the kind of journey and making it feel more personal. And Egyptology is a very visual. I was very struck when you were just saying just now that you don't get that same sense from some other books on the history of our subjects. And Egyptology is a very, very visual subject. It always has been. Yes. I mean, the closest I've ever come to sort of being able to pin down why it is that I am drawn to Egypt is because it's a very visual culture, and sure, there you can read about it and get a certain something from it, but you really need to be able to see things. And so from that point of view, in the pre-photography days in particular, drawings were everything.
Yeah.
And so to tell a history of the subject without those drawings, without those images, is to tell it in a way that doesn't give you the full story.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm looking at the Denon stuff at the moment, and you're seeing this kind of evolution of the depiction of what is there in his work, which is really
again,
more importantly.
Yeah. Aman again was very conscious of that and very aware that if you open the book at page 20, you'd see a particular kind of drawing, like a Norden or Pocock drawing of a sort of classical looking sculpture that we know in reality looked much more Egyptian. And if you turned to the book 20 pages from the end, you'd see a lot more photography, because that had come to be the thing. And all of those sorts of stages of the process in between are nicely represented, I think. So there's that sort of subtle evolution to it. Again, that's the work of the artists themselves, and it's the work of Aman in designing the book in that way.
One thing that strikes me, well, there's quite a few things that strike me really when looking at these pictures. One of them is just the levels of, call them detritus, sand, but also like the accumulation of human culture in these sites that has since been cleared and washed away to reveal what is, conceived of as the quote unquote Egyptian, true Egyptian, ancient Egyptian culture. Really striking to see just how buried so many of these temples were. But also, there's this with Denon's stuff as well. Dominique Vivant Denon, is that right? Have I said that right?
Yeah.
With his stuff, it seems like this is almost one of the turning points with him and is it Cost or Coast?
Same.
Yeah. So where we get to the point where the modernization and the excavation starts to begin in the early 19th century, or late 18th and early 19th century, in slightly more haste. And with the coming of the modernization under Ali and the saltpeter mines, the various different mining activities, we've got this sense of these people are recording, but also sharing responsibility for destroying many of the things depicted here. And there is definitely a kind of coming to this point a little early, but I think it's kind of the appropriate point in history. This almost bittersweet sense of loss that pervades the early depictions in this book, in the sense that, that particular apostle hall doesn't exist anymore, or those columns don't exist anymore, or that temple has since been completely dismantled to provide stone for something else. But equally, there's also kind of a bit of a sense of a ray of hope, in the sense that these are the preservations of those things.
Yeah.
This becomes a work of archaeology unto itself, to almost excavate these images and preserve them. So is there a sweet spot between, in the historical record, so to speak, is there's kind of a sweet spot of where these people are traveling between the uncovering and the excavation and the destruction? Like, is there a point at which what you can see is still, it's better than it was, but it's not been destroyed yet? And when would that be, roughly, do you think?
That's a really interesting question. Everything you said then was great. Yeah, there's so much there to think about. Is there a sweet spot? Do you know, one thing that I want to say by way of an answer actually is, despite the fact that this is a book that is all about records that were made and the importance of them, it would be sort of churlish and cynical to say, yes, but what about all the stuff that they didn't document? But actually, in trying to answer that question, is there a sweet spot? I don't really know. And one of the things that's in my mind, just so by way of sort of explaining myself a bit better, the documentation, I think, reaches a sort of new height and something of a pinnacle in the 1820s with the Robert Hay expedition. I think in many ways the Hay expedition, which never published, which is sort of in some ways a failure, but an opportunity for me.
Yeah, well, yeah, because he did so much. I mean, I've got lists of notes here.
It's insane how much he did, and he employed. Hay is a good example of somebody who is actually representative of a group in the book. It's really his story. He's the leader of the project.
Yeah.
He made drawings himself. He's the driving force behind the whole thing. And this was, by the way, for anybody listening who doesn't know the story, this was to make a comprehensive record of standing monuments in Egypt. Anything ancient that he came across, he wanted to document one way or another. And he did this himself, but he also, from the very beginning, and over the course of 2 expeditions, both of which lasted several years, he recruited a number of artists of various different kinds, each of whom has their own distinctive style, but collectively it allowed the project to capture all aspects, really, of sites and monuments, from down to the minutest detail of the decoration of a tomb, to epigraphy, by which I mean copying decoration, inscriptions and images from tomb walls or temple walls with a level of accuracy that's maybe doesn't quite meet modern standards, but it's certainly a giant leap forward from what had gone before, most of what had gone before. And it certainly made inscriptions legible, and that was very important. But it also, captured architectural details, landscapes, vistas, and plans as well, accurate surveyor's plans of quite large stretches of land. Yeah. In some cases, in doing all of that, his survey was really kind of new level, new standard, and wouldn't be improved upon for a few decades at least. And they never published. So the archives made its mark on Egyptology because it did subsequently come to be used by other Egyptologists, but it was never published. So it never reached a wide audience in the way that it might have done, and in the way that it was intended. Where am I going with this? Oh yeah, sorry, the sweet spot. The sweet spot. So 1820s, from the documentation point of view, is a peak. Right. It's a new peak. Right. But already by that point, Drovetti, the French consul, and his agents, and Henry Salt, the British vice consul and consul general, and his agents have already started to tear sites apart, looking for stuff. So the sort of the very substantial and final clearance of temples of the accumulation that you mentioned, in many cases doesn't happen until quite a long time later, but they'd already started tearing the ground apart. Yeah. And tragically, I can't help but say it like that, that was done with almost no documentation of what was going on at all.
Yeah, much to the lamentation of later archaeologists.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's happening in the sort of later years of the 18 teens. Belzoni's pretty much done by 1820. I can't remember when he was last in Egypt, but he's pretty much done by that point. Is there a sweet spot? I'm not sure there really is. At the point at which stuff starts to get torn to shreds, the documentation hasn't quite reached a point.
Yeah, because you've got a lot of people operating in the early 19th century, don't you? I mean, you've got William John Banks, who just rocked up and claimed an obelisk, but helped reveal, we'll say in air quotes, Abu Simbel, recorded hieroglyphs for Thomas Young. I mean, that sounds like it might have been quite instrumental in some ways, or quite useful to Thomas Young, who was very involved in the hieroglyphic. Just for anyone listening who's not familiar, I keep assuming knowledge, so I pull myself back sometimes to do that for anyone who's listening. So there was a bit of a race between Champollion, who I don't want to really focus too much on because there's so much said about him already.
Yeah,
you do bring an original contribution to Champollion in this book, again with the records that you bring to the work. But there was this kind of somewhat contentious, it seems, race between Thomas Young and Champollion. And I didn't realize quite how involved this world was. And of course, it's only because I hadn't thought about it, because of course it was a fairly small world. And of course, Robert Hay was a contemporary of James Burton and Wilkinson later on. And yeah, of course, these people all knew each other. And of course, there would be probably an area of competition in addition to collaboration in certain areas. And it kind of strikes me that there are some people who are out there doing this, as you rightly know, kind of copying down or doing this version of epigraphy, copying down all these texts because, of course, we needed the texts. in so much as the various parties in Europe were in a race to decipher the hieroglyphs, and the texts is what people wanted. And do you think that perhaps it is that narrow focus in some ways, and the focus on the golden texts, and particularly on objects that had artistic significance and stuff, was that to the detriment of the archaeology of the time?
Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah. I mean, I think there wasn't the recognition of what we would call archaeological context.
Yeah.
So, just the fact that it's not only the object itself, I can't think of a better word, the context in which it's found that's very important. So, I don't know, to give you an example, the coffin from KV 55, which was discovered in KV 55. Sorry, this is not really something to do with notebooks as so much, but I'm just trying to think of a good example to illustrate the point. The coffin that was found in KV 55, there is evidence on the coffin itself for us to associate it with Akhenaten.
Right.
And there's a mummy inside it, and the mummy turns out to be the mummy of a male, and a male of a certain age. So there's a certain amount of information in there. And in that case, that thing was found in a what is a very, very complicated context, which archaeologists are still arguing over today.
Yeah.
If that tomb had been found 200 years earlier by some unscrupulous individual who was not interested remotely in archaeological context, only in getting beautiful things out and maybe selling them, we would never have known where that came from, that coffin, as is the case for hundreds, thousands of coffins, and then thousands, millions of other kinds of objects.
Yeah.
And that would mean, in other words, what we know about death and burial at the end of the Amarna period largely depends on us having all of those things, not just separately, but having discovered them in one place, and being in a situation where they have a particular relationship to one another. So there was no understanding at all that there might be any value in that. So when people like Belzoni and Jean-Jacques Riffaut and others were tearing Karnak, say, apart, looking for very beautiful pieces of sculpture which now adorn the galleries of the British Museum and the Louvre and the Museo Egizio and other places, there was just no awareness at all that scooping these things out of the ground and shipping them off without making any notes, or bothering to take any notice at all of the relationship of one thing to another, and so much was lost in that. And the other thing is, there was no recognition until much later of the importance of other kinds of things, not beautiful things and not inscribed things, and the value of those. So, and the other thing is, and this reminds me of sort of lesson one of doing an archaeology degree, or at least where I did it, which is all archaeology is destructive. It's like the first, I don't know how it was for you, it's like the first thing we were told when I was a student. All archaeology is destructive, meaning the moment you put a spade in the ground, you're going through the archaeological context, and you might find a wonderful thing at the bottom, but without that context, its value is potentially degraded by 95% or whatever. And that just wasn't recognized at all. And so, and the point of that sort of phrase, all archaeology is destructive, once you put the spade in the ground, you can't get that stuff back, it's gone. So all of that stuff that was dug up in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, so much was lost irretrievably in that moment. Until we can time travel, we have lost all of that.
But then at the same time, I suppose, like to give it a balancing hand, you have people like Banks, who wanted to just tear up an obelisk and take it home, and subsequently did. He still discovered the king lists of Ramesses II at Abydos, which arguably provided us with an awful lot of information for context, to a degree, at least.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of the Banks obelisk, I'm not sure that we really know anything about the situation in which it was found, but it seems a reasonable thing to think that it was just lying around, and that actually there wasn't a lot of context to lose. That's not impossible. You can argue about the rights and wrongs of it leaving Egypt at all, but it may not be that we lost very much in that process in that case. And you're right that actually his contribution is very significant, in that he was a major player in the decipherment, not in making advances himself, but in supplying people like Thomas Young and by extension Champollion and others with new texts. Yeah. In the case of the Abydos King list, he discovered it, copied it, made the copies available to Young, and left it where it was, only to find that a few years later somebody else would come along and hack it out of the wall and take it home for their own personal collection. So, on that score, Banks is certainly did the right thing by comparison with somebody who came after him. I think another way of looking at this is to say Egyptology couldn't have made the advances that it did. You can sort of wish that Belzoni hadn't filled in the well in the tomb of Seti I, allowing flash flood water into the tomb, destroying half of it. And you can wish that Belzoni had said, no, actually, let's wait and not excavate Karnak until we've got better recording techniques.
Let's not use dynamite.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let's not just go. Well, but again, in the whole grand scheme of things, Belzoni wasn't by any means the worst.
No,
there were far worse people, and I think there's also a sort of implicit assumption somehow that we now, today, in the 21st century, we do everything completely, brilliantly, correctly. And if in 100 years' time or 200 years' time, a technique is invented that will allow us to virtually excavate things without touching a grain of sand, then suddenly all excavation is going to seem terrible.
And that's all we have time for today, but I wanted to thank Chris again for his generosity, and Thames and Hudson for the review copy of the book. If you fancy heading to Egypt with Dr. Chris, he runs mostly annual tours, COVID allowing, so check out his website, chrisnaunton.com. Links in the description for more details, and I urge you to pick up his books, Searching for the Lost Tombs of Egypt and Egyptologist Notebooks. And in case you missed it, Chris and I both appear on the show Egypt's Unexplained Files over on Discovery Science Channel. It debuted last year, but I'm pretty certain you can catch fairly regular reruns of that. And let me know what you thought of it in the comments, because I haven't really seen it. As ever, be sure to check out the other part of this two-part interview and check back in for some exciting episodes coming up. I have Spartacus and Nightfall's Simon Merrills incoming. As ever, I've been Paul Harrison. Thanks for listening.